Demanding a DNA test for 20 years, my father finally got what he wanted, but at a heavy cost. My parents have been married for over 20 years, and after having me, no matter how much they tried, they could not have another child. Both of their medical checkup results were normal, with only my father having some issues. Doctors believed that my father's reproductive health problems were mainly due to excessive alcohol consumption. He would drink every day, and no meal would be complete without alcohol. Sometimes, he would get so full from drinking that he wouldn't touch any of the food on the table. My father's job was quite stressful, and in addition to alcohol, he smoked a lot of cigarettes. One pack of cigarettes was only enough for him for one day, and whenever he felt restless or had a bad taste in his mouth, he would reach for a cigarette. He even insisted on smoking a few cigarettes in the hallway before undergoing endoscopic surgery. As time went on, it became increasingly difficult for my parents to have another child. Despite the doctor's warnings, my father dismissed their concerns, believing they were exaggerating. Even when alcohol and cigarettes not only affected his reproductive health but also his overall health, he stubbornly refused to give up those harmful habits. Eventually, my parents gave up trying to have another child when I was 16 years old. By that time, my mother was older, and her health could not guarantee a safe pregnancy, let alone considering the health issues of my father and me. All of this led my mother to accept that she could only have one daughter, which was me. The most ironic part was that, despite having only one daughter, my father always doubted that I was his biological child. Because of this thought, he treated me colder than even his nephews and nieces. Moreover, I am a girl. He has hurt me countless times by saying that he would rely on my male cousin in the future for support. When I was growing up, I was deeply depressed by these words, but over time, I became numb and considered my father's comments as drunken talk. And it's best not to care about what a drunk person says. Every time my father drank and spoke, he would insist on taking me for a DNA test, claiming that I was definitely not his child. My mother, of course, didn't bother to argue. Despite his hurtful and irrational words, my father had never been physically abusive or violent towards our family. It was just thoughtless outbursts that he didn't bother to think about before speaking. Perhaps that's why my mother never considered divorcing him. Especially in the past decade, as doctors continually warned about his reproductive health, my father became even more bitter and spiteful towards my mother and me. Every time there was a family gathering or an event, with all the relatives present, and everyone had their children around, my father would inevitably insist on taking a DNA test as others' words provoked him. For many years, my father remained like this, knowing that my mother and I wouldn't react, so his words grew more outrageous. Until one day, my mother finally couldn't bear it any longer. That morning, my mother left for work later than usual. Instead of going to her workplace, she went to the hospital to pick up the DNA test results she had secretly taken without my knowledge. She sat at home all day, waiting for my father and me to return from work and school. She placed a brand new A4 sheet of paper on the table. It was the DNA test result for my father and me. A 99.99% match. I don't know why, but when I saw that paper, I burst into tears right in front of my parents. The resentment of 20 years accumulated and erupted. Wasn't this the very thing my father had always doubted? Wasn't this what he wanted to do? Now it was right in front of him. Was he satisfied? My mother placed another sheet of paper in front of my father. It was a signed divorce application. I told you, she said. If a DNA test is what you wanted, regardless of whether the result showed the child was yours or not, it would mean the end of our relationship. Our love would be exhausted, and our connection severed. My father fell silent, not uttering a word. I didn't dare look at his eyes, but I was sure that at that moment, he must have been experiencing a whirlwind of emotions: doubt, surprise, regret, and pain. That night, my father left the house. He didn't say anything, just left a letter on the table. My mother didn't open it right away. I saw her hesitate, not wanting to confront my father's final words. In the days that followed, my mother became truly single. She no longer had to endure my father's bitter words. But I could see that her heart carried a broken piece that couldn't be healed. I also understood that love doesn't easily end, even if it's a love filled with tears and pain. As time went by, my mother and I tried to live happily, forgetting the sad days. I always tried to study, work, and take care of my mother as best as I could, to repay her sacrifices throughout her life. One day, I accidentally ran into my father at a coffee shop. He looked at me, his eyes full of remorse. I didn't say anything, just sat down next to him and held his hand. My father cried, and I couldn't hold back my tears either. We didn't need words to understand each other. We had made mistakes and lost the most precious thing in our lives. From then on, my father began to re-enter our lives. Even though he was no longer my mother's husband, he was still my father. We learned to forgive each other, gradually reconciling and rebuilding our family relationship despite the storms we had weathered. My father began to care for my mother and me, and even though we no longer lived under the same roof, our family bond was preserved and nurtured. My mother also gradually agreed to let my father visit us, sharing the joys and sorrows of life. Though she no longer loved him as she once did, she still respected and valued his role in my life. My father, who was once the source of my mother's pain, now became a companion and confidant. I understood that life isn't always smooth and happy. Sometimes we must go through challenges and turbulence to grow and better understand the value of love and forgiveness. Now, looking back on the past, I feel grateful for what happened, as it helped me mature and learn many valuable lessons in life. In the end, my family found peace and happiness in new relationships, cherishing each moment together. I realized that sometimes, acceptance and forgiveness are the keys to unlocking the door to happiness.